Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, despite the hoopla surrounding the U.S.'s quote unquote great deal with China over access to rare earths once again, the reality is China is dealing a decisive blow to U.S. military production.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, it's incredible that someone at some point in the last 5 years didn't sit there and go, if we're going to try and go to war with China in terms of a trade war, what are the fundamental risks in doing so? What would be a big problem? And really, the first thing, amongst a number of other things, should have been rare earths. Who actually refines a huge percentage of rare earths on planet Earth? It's the Chinese, irrefutably. And, the United States currently imports, or did prior to the fact that China now, of course, is putting restrictions on military exports and leaving it more for commercial, but also having to put other measures in place, which we can speak about in a bit. But effectively, 85% of rare earth imports come from China. And the country mines, China alone, probably 75% of the world's rare earths. And they practically have a monopoly on refining and processing. And someone in the United States should have sat there and gone, hang on a minute. Are we aware of this? Do we know what this relates to? And just to put a bit of context on this, and it's worth spending a little bit of time going through all this. One of the restrictions the United States is putting currently, China's putting, sorry, on the United States, relates to rare earth magnets. Now, let's just break down some of the uh, applications and technology that needs them. And weapons is a great example because rare earth magnets are critical in missile guidance systems that enables, precision targeting. They're also used for precision guided munitions to make them far more accurate. They're also used in energy weapons, so including lasers. And that's just a few points. You could go on and on discussing weapon systems in terms of military vehicles. They're used in electric motors. They're used in tanks. They're used obviously in UAVs. I'm sure everyone knows they're unmanned aerial vehicles, but just in case they don't, because not everyone who listens is English, that's to also improve their performance. They're used in navigation systems, for example, in tanks and other vehicle control systems. They're also used in communications and electronics, so radar and sonar, obviously enhancing detection capabilities. They're used as well for satellite communications. They're used for night vision and optical devices. That obviously is to improve capabilities on the battlefield. They're used in electronic warfare systems and communication devices. And they're obviously used in all aspects of UAVs. They're also used in aircraft, including radar and targeting systems. And they're used in naval systems or naval platforms, so for missile guidance, radar, sonar, also destroyers, submarines, and obviously they have high magnetic strength. I mean, and therefore you have much better scalability for the size. They can be much smaller and lighter. You manufacture better devices, more powerful. They're also heat resistant, which is extremely important in all missile and military technologies. I mean, and that's just a kind of rough 2 or 3 minute discussion about this. Now, someone should have there and gone, hang on, we're totally dependent in the United States on these. If we start really upsetting the Chinese, what happens if they decide to stop sending rare earths that are refined, stop sending magnets, which they are? What are we going to do? And it's very obvious, well, I think from my perspective, with regards to the dependency the United States has on these. Now, we know the Ukraine war is a great example. Exhausted the United States' military hardware. They had missiles, tanks, etc. they could send, but they can't now manufacture weapons because they don't have access to rare earths, which they need, and magnets. So is this why the United States is desperate to get the war to end ASAP? Because they can't actually support Ukraine in fighting the war anymore. I mean, setting aside Ukraine doesn't have the military personnel, but they don't have the military hardware to do so. Is it also why? Because they diverted huge amounts of resources to Israel when the Israel-Iran war, 12-day war happened? Is that why they want that war over quickly? Because they've got nothing else to give them, and they can't manufacture weapons and technology quick enough to replenish stocks. So it's like, we can't fight a war anymore in Ukraine. We can't support the Israelis. They certainly can't have any ideas about Taiwan, even if that's at all feasible anymore. And therefore, by virtue of their own stupidity, and because they're totally dependent on China, China has effectively, by implementing these bans on providing magnets and rare earths to the United States for military capabilities or military or defense technologies, they have absolutely and irrefutably dealt a decisive blow to US military production and US military uh, ambition, or, because if they were seriously, and I don't think they are, contemplating some kind of conflict in a proxy sense with China, they've got nothing to give anyone, because how long is it going to take the United States to be able to manufacture the weapons, the techno, and utilize the technology they need using, for example, magnets? 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? We don't know. I mean, and that's just, for me, is the initial really obvious statement to make, that they're literally, and I'm going to say this, brain dead. To not go, we're totally dependent on China pretty much for all the refined rare earths. And if they were to completely cease exports to us, what is it going to do to our ability to manufacture weapons? And if they did have crazy ideas about starting wars with whoever, that's been curtailed. And therefore, back to the point, how can you not understand that? Because as soon as all this trade war started during Trump 1.0, from my perspective, the first thought I had was, well, all China needs to do is prevent rare earths and magnets being sent to the US. Just cease sending those, because you'll absolutely cause mayhem for the US in a military capacity. And it's a 5-second response to what the US did in Trump 1.0 with the trade war. Now, with all due respect, if I can understand that, surely someone in Trump administration 1.0, someone in Biden administration, and someone in Trump 2.0 would have sat there and gone, we can't do this. We can't go in and upset the Chinese the way we think we can, because they're going to have us over a barrel and cause us absolute mayhem.
You have to wonder because, what ear is President Trump listening to? First he was given the scenario about, oh, well, just make a deal with Ukraine and you can have access to $2 trillion worth of rare earth minerals. And first, of course, there was Greenland. Oh, we can access and get all those rare earth minerals. And going around the world, and there, of course, it just was hyperbolic garbage. But I think one of the important things that people don't realize is obviously there was the announcement of, we've made a deal with China and they are releasing at least over the next 90 days, and then a reevaluation will take place. of a number of different rare earths, not all, and magnets, produced rare earths in the form of magnets, will be go ahead and sold to the United States into the West. Well, what rarely was talked about, even by the mainstream media, was this is for civilian use only. Automobiles, computers, and solar panels, things of the like that. Going back to January, China has a ban on a control list, export control list for pretty much all of the U.S. Defense industry, whether it's General Dynamics, Boeing, Lockheed, all of them. And so these rare earths were not to go to anybody in the U.S. defense industry. What have we seen in the meantime? There was a story a few weeks ago that a country was buying rare earths who was not on the control list and then smuggling them over and trying to push them over to the US, etc. So China is already cracking down on that. And interestingly enough, when you take a look at what the US desperately needs, there was a story that came out from a publication about within the last week that the rare earth crunch is threatening the F-40, the establishment of the sixth generation fighter, the F-47. So if China's already got a sixth generation, we know that Russia does. U.S. doesn't have that. U.S. doesn't have hypersonics. And then, of course, this leads the Pentagon to pull out an old World War II doctrine called the America's Defense Production Act, which allows the Department of Defense to invest in companies that it needs resources for to fund, the military industrial, whatever, the defense industry. And that's what came about when it invested in that company for, I think, in Montana, which is a small rare earth industry. Well, the problem is one, that development's not going to take place until 2027. This doesn't include the fact that the U.S. does not have a production line. It can't take rare earths and turn them into magnets or anything of importance. They still have to offshore that. And when you get to 2027, you're coming pretty close to the end of Trump's 4-year tenure in office. Whoever takes over next, are they going to follow through with the same thing? So there's a lot of promises that have been made and hyperbolic statements. But the reality is that when things finally start to come to pass, we're almost to the point that one, they're going to be moot or meaningless, and two, we may have a new administration that just throws this away anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And another big problem that exists for the United States when someone finally went, oh dear, this is a problem. Instead of going, well, actually, let's make up with the Chinese, let's actually accommodate them, let's actually, you know, be a little bit more accommodating than perhaps with other trade partners, given we're so dependent on them. Yeah, at some point, we'd like to have our own rare earth metals and rare earth magnet uh, production facilities or operations, should I say, wherever that is in the world, and then we can phase the Chinese out. Well, what a surprise! They started scouring the world and went, hang on, wherever there is the potential for rare earth extraction, not entirely, so let's not blow this out of proportion. But in a lot of places, they went, oh, the Chinese are already here. They've already bought into these mines, what, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 5 years ago. Last week, you get the idea of what we're saying. So they don't even have access to potentially mining operations elsewhere in the world because China secured a huge percentage of them, not all of them. And this isn't just with regards to rare earths, it's a whole host of other commodities, which is why we said before, Xi travels around the world in 2024. People going, what's he doing? Precisely that, rubber stamping more mining operations. So China has a significant stake in these companies. and they finance it, they get the operations underway, and it's a win-win cooperation. China gets the resources cheaper, but also these companies don't get ripped off by as they did in the past when the West moved in, stole the assets and gave them nothing. So on that basis, the US has got nowhere to turn. Yes, they've got this one mine in the United States, but in production terms, it's only going to be a very small percentage of what the US needs. And yeah, you mentioned 2027. Well, it might not be 2027. And then even if you extract uh, the capability to mine rare earth magnets, they can't refine them. The US is incapable. So what are they going to do? Send them to China to be refined? I mean, this is how absurd it is. And China could go, well, sorry, we don't have the bandwidth. We're running at 100% capacity, even though they might not be. So, well, maybe we'll get round to doing yours in 5 years' time. And 2027 might be actually feasible. We can't say it isn't, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was later than that. Because when does the United States ever really deliver anything on time and to budget? That's the other thing. It's very rare to see that happening. This might be an exception. But yeah, the Pentagon woke up and realized this is a huge problem and we need to do something about it. But, this is why China's, 10, 20 years ahead of the game. They knew what was needed, what they needed, where they needed to go, what they needed to do domestically. And you'd think it's incredible the United States cannot refine rare earths. It cannot refine to or has the technology to produce magnets. It can't even enrich uranium. It doesn't have the capability. It doesn't have the technology. I mean, this is supposed to be a first world nation. So when you look at the fact of across the board, the amount of minerals the United States has to import and the percentage they need to import and how much they're reliant on the likes of the Chinese, but not also to some extent the Russians. But there's no doubt if China had not actually relaxed some of the export restrictions for commercial use, can you imagine companies that would have had problems? Or major car makers, for starters, would have supply shortages. And the other point worth making, it's not just rare earths and magnet. The United States has critical minerals for US manufacturing. There's probably a list of about a dozen of them. And they're 100% dependent, for example, on graphite or manganese that's used in steel, for example. I mean, there's also fluorspar, which is used in aluminium production. The US is wide open to being completely screwed over by other countries if the United States continues to try and bully them. And it's staggering the level of naivety that the US actually doesn't seem to be aware of how vulnerable it is. Because just a small point, how much rare earths the US Defense Department is dependent on them for fighter jets, for destroyers, for submarines, and the amount of rare earths used to make just one submarine alone is way in excess of what the United States domestically will be capable of producing. So where is the lack of thought given to this? And if the US has got any sense, it's going to make up with the Chinese, spend long enough that it can eventually become self-sufficient and manufacture and refine rare earths and produce and magnets, and then be in a position where it's not dependent on the Chinese, for example. But just I thought it's worth mentioning. I mean, just one F-35 fighter jet. Of course, the United States promises these to countries. I think Israel recently put a big order in. One of those uses over 400 kilograms of rare earths per plane. So that's related to advanced weapon targeting systems, radar, laser technologies. So they have to therefore use rare earths in the permanent magnets for flight control, etc. Now, if you're going to promise a country like Israel 10 of these, 20 of these, 50, I don't know, whatever it might be in the future, you're not going to have access to those rare earths. You can't do it. And this is why, you know, the United States also can't produce missiles. So whatever it's got left, which isn't a huge amount, because it gave so many of them to the Israelis and the Ukrainians, how long is it going to be before they can manufacture them? Years. So, ironically, the US has militarily exposed itself that it is in no position to be able to fight any form of ground warfare anywhere because it's got nothing to fight it with. I mean, for me, it's just absolutely incredible to think a nation of the US's standing at one point in history can be that stupid and naive to put itself in such a vulnerable position.
Yeah, and when you take a look at the F-35 is a great example because it took 35 years to develop it. Well, the world has already moved on. That's barely a fifth, late fourth, early fifth gen fighter. And in the meantime, we're already into the sixth gen. So even missing the resources. And one of the things I wanted to point out is people don't understand and realize the significance that Africa is going to play going into the latter half of this century. I saw a little meme the other day that the U.S. goes into Africa with missiles and guns, and China comes in with cranes to help develop. And this is why, the United States is pretty much getting more and more isolated. Europe is getting more and more isolated. Well, Africa is probably someplace that's going to be a boon, not just for rare earths, but just all types of resources in general, as well as development. So, if the U.S. right now can't develop some of the older aircraft that they've been, having in their inventories for the last 35 years, how do we expect them to be able to develop anything, much less be able to develop refining for rare earths? And in the end, even if they access this new uh, joint venture up in Montana for rare earths, even if they get some new agreements, they only produce less than 1% of what China does annually. So you're not going to be able to, for a an empire as big as it is and all of its obligations, they're not even going to come close to being able to do this.
No, absolutely. And that's why, you know, don't go into a gunfight, not even with a knife. Don't go into a gunfight with a fork. I mean, this is quite literally what the US is doing with China, and it's someone somewhere needs to just sit someone down and go, do you realize how vulnerable you are? Do you not understand that China's got you over a barrel, and you know what? They can extract maximum pain, and you need to make friends with them. You need to agree 100% you're never going to go near Taiwan. Although the problem is China will never believe them because unlike the Russians, they don't fundamentally trust the US in anything they say. Russia likes to keep believing the US can change and be like a recovering alcoholic, for a want of an analogy. But China doesn't believe this. So China will quite happily keep turning the screw, and there's nothing the United States can do about it in the next 5, 10 years, probably, and maybe arguably even longer than that. And in some cases, they might be never in a position to challenge China in this way. So don't do it. Make friends with them, have win-win cooperation. After all, China's happy to do that because in the end, the United States will benefit from doing that. If they don't, China can cause the United States a world of pain, and not just in relation to rare earths and magnets.
Absolutely. Paul, was there any other thoughts you had regarding this?
No, I think that's fine.
Want to thank everybody here, as always, at the Sirius Sport community for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.